"You can't be here. This is a restricted area." The voice was sharp, cutting through the constant howl of wind across the flight deck. It came from a man who was more gear than human, a walking monolith of advanced armor, weaponry, and cold purpose. Stanley Barton, 84 years old and wearing a simple windbreaker, didn't flinch. He kept his eyes on the gray, churning expanse of the Atlantic. The deck of the USS Independence vibrated beneath his worn leather shoes, a familiar deep hum that felt more like a memory than a sensation. Another figure identical to the first stepped up to flank him. They were Navy SEALs, their movements economical and predatory. "Did you hear him, old man?" the second one asked, his voice a low growl muffled by his tactical helmet. "We need you to come with us, now." Stanley finally turned his head. His neck was thin, the skin a roadmap of wrinkles, but his eyes were a pale, clear blue as steady and vast as the ocean around them. He looked from one operator to the other, his gaze lingering not on their rifles or the array of pouches on their vests, but on their faces, barely visible behind ballistic eyewear and comms equipment. "I'm waiting for the Admiral," Stanley said, his voice raspy but calm. The lead SEAL, a young lieutenant named Mason, let out a short, incredulous laugh. "The Admiral? I'm sure he's just dying to have a chat with you. Let's go. Hands behind your back." The wind whipped harder, carrying the scent of salt and jet fuel. In the distance, the island superstructure of the aircraft carrier loomed like a steel mountain, its radar arrays spinning in a silent, ceaseless watch. A handful of deck crew, busy with their pre-launch checks, had started to notice the confrontation. They slowed their work, their curiosity piqued by the bizarre tableau. Two of the Navy's most elite warriors confronting a man who looked like he could be their great-grandfather. Stanley didn't move. He simply stood there, a frail silhouette against the immense metallic landscape of the carrier. "I'm not going anywhere," he stated, not with defiance but with a simple, unshakable certainty. Lieutenant Mason's patience, already worn thin by a grueling training cycle, snapped. This was a security breach, a serious one. A civilian, an elderly one at that, had somehow made it to the flight deck of a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier during active operations. Every protocol screamed at him to neutralize the threat, and this old man's placid refusal was like sand in the gears of his finely tuned training. "That's not a request," Mason said, stepping so close he could see the fine white stubble on Stanley's chin. He lowered his voice, a technique meant to intimidate, to create a bubble of concentrated pressure. "I don't know who you are or how you got up here, but you are in a world of trouble. You are interfering with military operations. Now, for the last time, you will comply." He reached out, his gloved hand ready to grip Stanley's thin arm. Around them, the audience of sailors grew. They could sense the shift in the air, the tightening of a wire. The routine of their day was broken, and they were now spectators to a drama playing out on the most dangerous 4.5 acres on the planet. The SEALs were the ship's guardians, the apex predators. The old man was an anomaly, an unwelcome ghost. Stanley looked at the approaching hand and then back at Mason's eyes. A flicker of something ancient and weary passed through his own. "Son," he said, his voice still quiet but carrying a new weight, "you should be more careful who you put your hands on." The words, so utterly out of place, so completely devoid of fear, struck Mason as the ramblings of a confused mind. Senility, that had to be it. He'd seen it before. He exchanged a look with his teammate, a silent communication that confirmed their assessment. This wasn't a threat, it was a problem to be managed. "All right, that's enough," Mason declared, his tone shifting from aggressive to dismissive. He grabbed Stanley's arm. The fabric of the windbreaker was thin, and underneath the arm was wiry but surprisingly solid. He began to maneuver Stanley's hands behind his back. "You're coming with us. We'll get you sorted out," the crowd of sailors murmured. It was an uncomfortable scene. There was no dignity in it. One of them, a young aviation boatswain's mate, muttered to his friend, "They're really going to cuff the old guy?" As Mason pulled Stanley's arm back, the sleeve of his windbreaker rode up past his wrist, exposing the pale, wrinkled skin of his forearm. And there, faded by decades of sun and salt, was a tattoo. It was dark and crudely rendered, not the clean work of a modern parlor. It depicted a skeletal frog, clutching a stick of dynamite. The motion was rough, and for a split second the world shifted for Stanley. The cold wind on his face became a blast of humid jungle heat. The smell of jet fuel was replaced by the cloying scent of mud and decay. The gray steel of the deck dissolved into a vision of firelight flickering against dark, sweating skin, the sting of a needle tracing lines of ink and blood. He heard a scream, a man's voice, swallowed by the deafening roar of an explosion and the rush of dark water. It was over in a heartbeat. He was back on the deck of the Independence, the cold air biting at his cheeks, a young man's hands binding his own with a plastic flex cuff. The SEAL hadn't even glanced at the tattoo, dismissing it as just another piece of the old man's strange puzzle. He cinched the cuff tight, the plastic biting into Stanley's thin wrists, but someone else had noticed. Chief Petty Officer Miller, a man whose face was its own testament to 25 years of naval service, stood 50 feet away, a wrench in his hand. He'd been overseeing a maintenance check on a catapult launch system when the commotion started. He'd watched the whole thing unfold, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. He'd seen a lot in his career. He'd seen fear and he'd seen bravado. He'd seen the vacant eyes of shell shock and the arrogant glare of power. In the old man, he saw none of those things. He saw a profound and unsettling stillness, a patience that seemed forged in pressures modern sailors could barely comprehend. When the SEALs put their hands on him, something inside Miller screamed that this was wrong. It wasn't just a breach of respect for the elderly. It felt like a desecration. He wasn't high-ranking enough to challenge a SEAL lieutenant in the middle of a security operation. A CPO yelling at an officer, especially a SEAL, was a career-ending move. But doing nothing felt worse. While Mason and his partner were radioing for a security detail to escort their detainee to the brig, Miller made a decision. He turned his back on the scene, pulling out his personal cell phone, a minor infraction on the flight deck, but one he was willing to risk. He didn't call ship security. He scrolled through his contacts to a number he rarely used, the direct line to the Admiral's aide-de-camp. He took a deep breath, the wind threatening to steal the words from his mouth. "Lieutenant, this is Chief Miller on the flight deck. I apologize for calling you directly, sir, but we have a situation up here." The voice on the other end was clipped, annoyed. "Chief, what is it? Is it an emergency?" "I don't know, sir. Maybe. There's a SEAL team, ST-6. They're detaining a civilian, an old man, a civilian on the flight deck." "Then it sounds like the SEALs are doing their job, Chief." Miller's grip tightened on the phone. He had to get this right. "Sir, with all due respect, something's not right. They're treating him poorly. And the man, he's not resisting. He's just standing there. He says he's here to see the Admiral. His visitor pass says his name is Stanley Barton." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Miller could hear the faint sound of typing. He held his breath, the fate of his career, and possibly the dignity of the old man, hanging in the balance of this single desperate phone call. He was just a chief, a nobody in the grand scheme of things. But he knew the Navy's soul, and he knew it was being violated out here on the windy deck. He just prayed someone else would see it too. The aide-de-camp walked briskly into the flag bridge, the nerve center of the carrier strike group. Admiral Hayes stood before a wall of monitors displaying tactical data from half a dozen different platforms. He was a man accustomed to seeing the world as a series of strategic problems to be solved. "Sir," the aide said, "Chief Miller from the flight deck reports a minor security issue. A civilian has been detained by Lieutenant Mason's team. An elderly man, says his name is Stanley Barton." Hayes didn't turn around. "A civilian, on the deck. Have security escort him to the brig and find out how in the hell he got past 4 security checkpoints. I want a full report in an hour." His voice was stone, annoyed by the distraction. "Sir," the aide hesitated. "The name, Stanley Barton." The Admiral stopped. He slowly turned, a question in his eyes. "Repeat that name." "Barton, sir. Stanley." The change was instantaneous and total. The casual annoyance vanished, replaced by an expression of utter disbelieving shock. The Admiral's posture straightened, every ounce of his 2-star authority snapping into focus. He strode across the bridge to his personal secure terminal, his polished shoes echoing on the deck. "Get the Fleet Master Chief on the line." "Now," he commanded, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He typed the name into a secure database reserved for the Navy's most deeply held secrets. A file appeared on the screen. The text was heavily redacted, but the headings were clear. Operation Sea Serpent, UDT-12, Sole Survivor, Congressional Medal of Honor, classified. Admiral Hayes's face went white. He looked as though he had seen a ghost. He slammed his hand down on the desk. "Belay that last order," he barked at the aide, his voice a thunderclap that made every officer on the bridge freeze. "Get me my cover and tell the driver to bring my vehicle to the hangar bay elevator. Scramble the Marine Honor Guard. I want them on the flight deck in 5 minutes." He turned to the comms officer. "Get me Lieutenant Mason, now." The connection crackled to life. "Lieutenant, this is Admiral Hayes. You will release the man in your custody immediately. You will not touch him. You will not speak to him. You will stand by and await my arrival. Is that understood?" Back on the flight deck, the wind howled, whipping at Stanley's thin jacket. Mason had just finished his call to security and was feeling the smug satisfaction of a problem solved. The stand-down order from the Admiral hadn't reached him yet. It was still being routed through the chaotic comms channels. He leaned in close to Stanley, the picture of condescending authority. "All right, Grandpa, your little game is over," he said, his voice dripping with finality. He gestured to his teammate. "Let's get him moving. We're taking you to the brig for a nice long chat. After that, I'm thinking a psychiatric evaluation is in order. Maybe we can find you a nice quiet room somewhere." This was his final act of dominance. He was clearing a threat, restoring order. He was a SEAL, and this was what he did. He put his hand on Stanley's shoulder to guide him forward, a gesture of absolute control. The crowd of sailors watched, a grim silence having fallen over them. This felt less like a security procedure and more like a public shaming. Just as the SEALs began to walk Stanley toward the hangar elevator, a powerful horn blast echoed across the deck, a sound no one ever heard during flight operations. All heads snapped toward the island superstructure. A procession of 2 black command vehicles, lights flashing, was speeding across the flight deck, a flag with 2 stars fluttering from the lead vehicle's fender. They screeched to a halt a few yards from the scene. The doors flew open. From the second vehicle, a squad of 8 Marines in full dress blues disembarked, their white gloves and gleaming rifles a stunning contrast to the drab, functional world of the flight deck. They moved with a chilling, synchronized precision, forming 2 perfect lines. Then, from the lead vehicle, Admiral Hayes emerged. He wasn't wearing a helmet or flight gear. He was in his service dress khaki uniform, his cover held perfectly under his arm. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. The entire flight deck went silent. The wind itself seemed to hold its breath. The spectacle of an admiral, with a Marine honor guard, driving onto an active flight deck was so far beyond protocol, it bordered on the unbelievable. The SEALs froze, their hands falling away from Stanley. They stood dumbfounded, their minds struggling to process what was happening. Lieutenant Mason felt a cold dread wash over him, a feeling he hadn't experienced since his first day in Bud/training. Admiral Hayes strode forward, his eyes locked on Stanley. He walked right past Lieutenant Mason as if he were a piece of deck equipment, his gaze never wavering. He stopped directly in front of the old man who still stood with his hands cuffed behind his back. Without a word, the Admiral pulled a small utility knife from his pocket, opened it, and personally sliced through the thick plastic of the flex cuff. The broken pieces fell to the deck. He gently rubbed Stanley's wrist where the plastic had dug in. Then, in full view of the SEALs, the Marines, and the now massive crowd of sailors, Admiral Hayes snapped to attention. It was not a casual gesture. It was a salute of such rigid, profound respect that it seemed to vibrate with energy. His hand was a razor-sharp line to his brow, his back ramrod straight, his eyes fixed on the old man. "Mr. Barton," the Admiral's voice boomed, carrying effortlessly on the wind. "It is an honor to have you aboard the USS Independence. I apologize for the conduct of these men. There is no excuse for the disrespect you have been shown today." He held the salute, his arm trembling slightly with the force of his conviction. Stanley simply nodded, a deep sadness in his eyes. The Admiral dropped his salute and turned to face the stunned audience, his gaze sweeping over the SEALs, the sailors, and his own honor guard. "For those of you who do not know," he began, his voice taking on the quality of a historian reciting a sacred text, "this man is Stanley Barton. To most, he's a retired machinist from Ohio. To the United States Navy, he is a ghost, a legend we tell to trainees to remind them what the human spirit is capable of." He took a step closer to the SEALs, his eyes boring into Lieutenant Mason. In 1968, during a classified reconnaissance mission off the coast of North Vietnam, then Petty Officer Barton's 4-man underwater demolition team was ambushed. Their submersible was destroyed. 2 men were killed instantly. For 3 days and 3 nights in enemy territory, Petty Officer Barton kept his wounded commander alive. He carried him for miles through dense jungle, neutralized 2 enemy patrols single-handedly, and navigated by the stars to a clandestine extraction point that hadn't been used in years. His actions were deemed so sensitive, his survival so improbable, that the mission report was buried, and his Medal of Honor was awarded in a secret ceremony at the White House, and then immediately classified for 50 years. The Admiral pointed a rigid finger at Stanley's exposed forearm. "Lieutenant Mason, you and your men wear the SEAL trident. You are the polished tip of the spear. This man, and men like him, forged that spear in mud and blood with nothing but a knife in their guts. The tattoo on his arm is not a decoration. It is the emblem of the UDTs, the frogmen. It was given to him by his brothers, the men who died next to him. He is the reason your teams exist. He is not a guest on this ship. He is part of its very keel." He is here today, at my personal invitation for the decommissioning of a torpedo system he helped design in his civilian life. You did not detain a confused old man. You detained a founding father of naval special warfare. A wave of shock and shame rippled through the crowd. Sailors who had been watching with detached curiosity now stood straighter, their faces filled with awe. Lieutenant Mason's face had gone from pale to ashen. The world had just been turned upside down. The frail old man was a giant, and he, the elite warrior, was a fool. Admiral Hayes now turned his full, undivided attention to the young lieutenant. His voice dropped, losing its booming quality and becoming a quiet, lethal weapon. Lieutenant, you are a graduate of the most demanding military training in the world. We taught you how to fight, how to shoot, how to survive, but it seems we failed to teach you how to see. You looked at this man and saw a threat based on his age and his presence in your domain. You mistook quiet dignity for weakness. You mistook a lifetime of experience for senility. Your failure today was not one of tactics but of character. You and your team will report to my office at 1400 hours. Be prepared to explain to me how you forgot the single most important principle of a warrior: respect. The Admiral's words hung in the air, colder and sharper than the wind. Mason could only stand there, stripped bare, the weight of his arrogance crushing him. Then Stanley Barton finally spoke. He stepped forward and placed a gentle, wrinkled hand on Lieutenant Mason's armored shoulder. The young man flinched as if touched by a hot iron. "Son," Stanley said, his voice soft, devoid of any anger or triumph. "Don't be too hard on yourself. That fire inside you, that need to protect, it's a good thing. It's the same fire we had." He tapped his own chest. "But this gear you wear, the rifle you carry, they don't make you a warrior. They're just tools. The real weapon is your judgment. It's about knowing when to act and when to simply stand and observe. You've got the first part down better than almost anyone. Don't ever forget the second." As he spoke, the image flashed in his mind again, clearer this time. A younger version of himself, no older than Mason, sat by a smoldering fire in a mangrove swamp. His friend, a man whose face was tight with pain, was using a sharpened piece of bamboo and a vial of gunpowder ink to painstakingly create the skeletal frog on his arm. It wasn't a celebration. It was a pact, a promise etched into their skin to remember the two brothers they had just lost to the sea. It was a mark of survival, born from failure and loss. The fallout was swift and decisive. Admiral Hayes instituted a new mandatory training module for the entire strike group, which was quickly adopted by Naval Special Warfare Command. It was called the Barton Protocol, a course on the history of the UDT and SEAL teams, with a special emphasis on humility, observation, and de-escalation. It required every operator, from the newest recruit to seasoned team leaders, to spend time at VFW halls and veteran hospitals, not as warriors but as listeners. Lieutenant Mason and his team were not discharged. Instead, they were the first to be enrolled in the new protocol. They were reassigned to a training billet, their deployment canceled. For 6 months they drilled not with weapons but with history books and long, quiet conversations with men whose heroism was recorded only in faded photographs and unspoken memories. 3 months later, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, a young man in civilian clothes walked into VFW Post 384 in Norfolk, Virginia. It was Mason. He carried no weapon, wore no armor. He spent the afternoon clearing tables, washing glasses, and listening. In a corner booth, Stanley Barton sat with 3 other veterans, all in their 80s, laughing over a shared memory. They weren't talking about war or medals. They were arguing about who was the worst cook on their first deployment in the 1950s. Stanley looked up and his eyes met Mason's across the dim, quiet room. There was no accusation in his gaze, only a calm, steady acceptance. Mason, his hands full of empty glasses, stopped and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a gesture of profound, hard-won respect. Stanley nodded back, a faint smile touching his lips, before turning back to his friends. The lesson was complete. The warrior had learned to see the man. Stanley Barton's story is a powerful reminder that heroes don't always wear their valor on their sleeves. If you were moved by his story of quiet strength, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe to Veteran Valor for more.